Long before the Pirate King sailed the Grand Line, before the world government ruled the seas, and before a single straw hat ever dreamed of freedom, there was a man whose name survived 800 years without a single living witness left to tell his story. The world buried his history, erased his kingdom, and silenced nearly every trace of his existence. Yet somehow, his promise continued to echo across the centuries, carved into ancient stone, whispered by forgotten civilizations, and carried forward by people who never even knew his name. If you enjoy relaxing One Piece documentaries, you're welcome to subscribe and let me know where you're listening from tonight. Then settle in, because tonight we're traveling farther into the past than almost any story in One Piece has ever taken us, following the forgotten path of Joy Boy from the birth of an ancient world to the mystery that still shapes every ocean today. We begin, as we must, in the dark. Not the ordinary dark of a night sky, but the deeper, administrative dark of a century that the world government spent 100 years erasing and 1,500 years since making sure stayed erased. This is the Void Century, the 100-year span sealed between the year 600 and the year 700 of the calendar the world now uses, and it is inside this sealed room of history that Joy Boy lived, walked, fought, and eventually failed at the one thing he seems to have wanted most. Almost nothing about him survives in the ordinary way that biography survives. There is no portrait. There is no birthplace recorded in any account that has reached the present day. There is no lineage, no confirmed devil fruit, no crew roster with his name at the top of it. What survives instead are traces, the kind of evidence a person leaves not by being written about, but by being written to. Every confirmed mention of Joy Boy that exists in the present day comes from something he left behind for someone else to find, long after he could no longer explain it himself. That is a strange way to know a person. You do not see his face. You only see the shape of what he cared enough about to leave standing. To understand why that is the only kind of evidence that survives him, you have to understand what happened to the century he lived in. The Void Century ended in a war. A single dominant civilization, remembered only as the Ancient Kingdom, because its true name was scrubbed so completely from the record that even the Poneglyphs that speak of the era declined to name it directly, was brought down by a coalition of 20 smaller kingdoms. That war lasted the better part of a century. It reshaped coastlines, it ended dynasties, and when it was finished, the 20 victorious kingdoms folded themselves into a single governing body, the world government, and set about making sure that no one born afterward would ever have reason to ask what exactly had been destroyed. They banned the language the ancient kingdom used to write its history. They made research into that era a crime severe enough to warrant a warship response. They built, over 1,500 years, an entire civilization's worth of not knowing. 20 kingdoms stood against whatever the ancient kingdom was during those 100 years, and among their founding families were names that would go on to define entire sagas of the present-day story without most of their descendants ever fully understanding what their ancestors had once stood against. The Nefertari family, who would come to rule the desert kingdom of Alabasta, was one of the 20. The Don Quixote family, whose descendants would eventually rule Dressrosa through very different means entirely, was another. Both families fought on the winning side of that war. Both families helped bring down whatever civilization Joy Boy belonged to, and both families would spend the following 1,500 years mostly unaware of the specific weight carried by that inheritance, since the details of what exactly their ancestors fought against were erased as thoroughly for the victor's own descendants as for everyone else. History, it turns out, does not always keep faithful custody even for the people who won it. When the war ended, the 20 kingdoms folded themselves into the world government and built their new seat of power on the Red Line, a holy city called Mary Jawaz, where the descendants of those founding families still live today, elevated to a status so far above ordinary rules that they travel the world in glass bubbles rather than breathe the same air as the people below them. It is a strange kind of victory to inherit, being granted permanent supremacy over a war whose true cause you were never allowed to fully learn. But before the erasure could finish its work, a small clan from a small isolated country did something extraordinarily stubborn. The Kozuki clan of Wano understood, in the middle of the war, that their side was likely to lose, and instead of accepting that the truth would be lost with it, they built a way to keep the truth standing after everything else had fallen. They carved it into poneglyphs, slabs of a stone that cannot be burned, cannot be cut, cannot be dissolved by any known method, written in a language that only their own bloodline could read. It is a peculiar kind of hope, building something specifically for a future you will not live to see, made of a material chosen precisely because you expect everyone around you to try to destroy it. And it is on those very stones, indestructible because someone anticipated exactly this kind of erasure, that the name Joy Boy first appears to us in the present day. If you're starting to feel the weight of the evening settling into your eyes, that's all right. Let it settle. I'll keep going at the same easy pace. The first and most emotionally direct of these traces sits on the ocean floor near Fishman Island, in the possession of the merfolk royal family. It is a poneglyph, and unlike most of the others scattered across the world, this one is not a historical record or a set of coordinates. It is a letter. It is an apology. It was left by Joy Boy, addressed to a mermaid princess who lived during the Void Century and who bore the title Poseidon, a title that in this world means something far heavier than royalty. To be Poseidon is to be born with the ability to command the great sea kings, the colossal creatures that move through the deepest currents of the ocean like slow ancient gods of their own. This ability made her, in the eyes of the ancient kingdom's enemies and allies alike, one of 3 ultimate weapons alongside the ship called Pluton, and a third, still barely understood force, called Uranus. We do not know the full content of what Joy Boy wrote to her. What survives, pieced together from fragments and later context, is this. He had made her a promise, and he had not been able to keep it. The promise appears to be connected to something enormous, a vessel called Noah, built to a scale that dwarfs almost every other ship in the story, resting even now on the seafloor near Fishman Island, under the care of the merfolk who have guarded it for centuries, without fully understanding what it was built to do. Joy Boy seems to have intended Noah to carry someone or something, somewhere, at some specific moment. Whatever that moment was, It came and passed, and he could not be there for it. So he left an apology carved into the one material that would still be legible 1,000 years later, because he seemed to understand, even in the middle of losing, that being unable to keep a promise did not excuse him from acknowledging it. To understand why Poseidon mattered so much, and why an apology to her would be worth carving into indestructible stone, you have to understand what the title actually meant to the people who feared it. A person born with the Poseidon inheritance is born a mermaid, or occasionally a merman, capable of speaking to the sea kings in a way no ordinary voice can manage, capable of calling them, calming them, or in theory, directing their colossal strength toward whatever purpose the bearer chooses. In the Void Century, this was treated by the ancient kingdom's enemies as a weapon on the same order as the warship Pluton and the still unclear force called Uranus, three legendary powers said to be capable of reshaping the world if used together. Whether the mermaid princess Joy Boy ever saw herself that way, as a weapon rather than a person, is not something the surviving fragments tell us. What they suggest, gently, through the tone of the apology itself, is that Joy Boy did not see her that way. He seems to have made her a promise the way you make a promise to someone you care about, not the way you make an arrangement with a strategic asset. That distinction, small as it sounds, may be the entire reason the apology exists in the form it does. You do not usually carve regret into unbreakable stone for a weapon. You do it for a person you let down. That title, Poseidon, did not vanish with the Void Century. It resurfaced many centuries later in the present-day story, carried by a young mermaid princess named Shirahoshi, who spent most of her childhood confined to a tower on Fishman Island, protected from a danger she barely understood, developing, without quite realizing it, the same rare ability to call sea kings that had made her ancient predecessor so significant during the war that reshaped the world. Shirahoshi never met Joy Boy, obviously, separated from him by 8 centuries of ordinary time, but the echo of that old promise runs quietly underneath her own story, too, in the way old debts sometimes shape the lives of people who never signed for them. Fishman Island itself, the community she was born into, carries its own long history of grief around the surface world's cruelty, a history that includes Fisher Tiger, a former slave who tore down the walls of a celestial dragon's auction house decades before the present-day story begins, and freed everyone inside it, an act that reshaped the entire relationship between Fishman Island and the world above the waves. None of that is Joy Boy's story directly, but it lives in the same water, carries the same old ache about promises and freedom and people who were never given a fair account of what they were owed. If any of this is starting to feel heavy in a way that's actually comfortable, the way a weighted blanket feels heavy, let it stay there. We're not rushing through any of it tonight. It was Nico Robin who eventually read that apology, centuries after it was carved, alone in the cold and pressure of the ocean floor beneath Fishman Island. She had spent her whole life being the only person capable of reading this vanished language, hunted for that exact ability since she was 8 years old. And here, in the quiet dark beneath the waves, The reward for all of that survival was to read the private regret of a man who had died more than 800 years earlier. Robin's relationship to reading is worth lingering on a little longer here, because it shapes how much weight this particular discovery actually carries for her. She had spent her whole life being punished simply for possessing the ability to read the Kozuki language, hunted since she was 8 years old for a skill she had done nothing except inherit an interest in, treated by the entire structure of the world government as a walking crime rather than a person. Every poneglyph she had ever read up to that point had been read in secret, in danger, usually with someone actively trying to capture or kill her before she could finish. The apology beneath Fishman Island was different only in the smallest of ways, and yet that smallest way seemed to matter enormously. For once, there was no one chasing her while she read. She was simply allowed, for a few quiet minutes in the pressurized dark, to be exactly what she had always secretly wanted to be, a person reading an old story because the story deserved to be read, not because her survival depended on decoding it fast enough to escape whoever was closing in. It is a small mercy buried inside a much larger and much sadder discovery, and it is easy to miss if you are moving quickly through the story. We are not moving quickly tonight, so we get to notice it. There is something almost unbearably tender in that image, if you let yourself sit with it. A scholar alone in the deep, holding a candle up to someone else's oldest grief. If a story like that feels like the right kind of company for tonight, you're welcome to subscribe, and to tell me what time it is where you are. Then we'll keep walking together. The second trace Joy Boy left behind sits at the very end of the Grand Line, on the island once called Raftel, and now known by the name Gold D. Roger gave it after he arrived there, Laugh-Tale. We do not know in full clarity what is actually on that island. The story has kept it deliberately, carefully hidden, even from us, even this far into the telling. What we do know is that Joy Boy set foot there during the Void Century, and that he left something behind, something the Poneglyphs describe only in terms vague enough to resist easy summary. Not a treasure in the ordinary sense of gold and jewels, though it may contain such things. Something closer to a message, or a truth, or an explanation, left for whoever eventually proved capable of reaching the same shore he once stood on. It would take nearly 800 years for anyone to manage it. Gold D. Roger did with his crew, using 4 scattered stones called the Road Poneglyphs, each one holding a fragment of the coordinates, none of them sufficient alone. The 4 road poneglyphs are not gathered in any single place. They are scattered across wildly different corners of the world, hidden behind their own dangers, their own guardians, their own centuries of quiet waiting. One rests deep in the ruins beneath Alabasta, guarded by the ancient mechanisms of a civilization that built an entire underground city to protect it. Another sits at the bottom of the sea near Fishman Island, close enough to the very apology stone we've already spoken of, that the two seem almost to be keeping each other company in the dark. A third can be found on the sky island of Zu, carried unknowingly on the back of Zunesha itself, as if the elephant's long punished walk has doubled without anyone intending it, as the transport for one more piece of the very map that might eventually explain the crime it was punished for. The fourth is harder to place, tangled up in circumstances still unfolding, even in the most recent chapters of the story, held by forces with their own reasons for keeping what they have close. Roger's crew visited each of these in turn, across years of searching, and Kozuki Oden, heir to the very clan that had carved the original warning stones, sailed with them specifically because he alone, among that crew, could translate what the stones said. He had come to the Roger pirates already carrying an extraordinary history of his own, having served first under Whitebeard as a division commander, then having crossed paths with Roger's ship somewhere in the vast waters of the Grand Line and chosen, almost on instinct, to transfer his allegiance one final time. With Odin aboard, reading each stone as they found it, the coordinates slowly assembled themselves into something navigable, a route across thousands of miles of ocean that no one before them had ever been able to complete. Together they gathered all 4 fragments and sailed to the end of the map, to the island Joy Boy had visited 8 centuries before them. And there they found whatever it was he'd left. Roger laughed, not politely, not briefly, but for a long time, uncontrollably. The way a person laughs when something lands somewhere far beneath the part of them that processes ordinary information. His whole crew laughed with him, and when it was over, he named the island for that laugh, and never fully explained what had caused it. He kept his own counsel about the details for the rest of his short life. What he told the world instead from a scaffold in Logtown with a blade about to fall was simpler. He said the treasure was real. He said it was still out there. He said anyone who wanted it could go and try. And an entire generation of pirates set sail on the strength of those words alone, most of them with no idea that the actual weight of what waited for them at the end of that road had first been carried there, 800 years earlier, by a man whose name almost none of them would ever learn. Let your breathing slow if it wants to. There's no urgency in any of this. The stones have been waiting a very long time. They can wait a little longer while we rest into the next part. There is a third relationship worth understanding, one that is less a message and more a wound that never closed. Somewhere in the world, at some point connected to this same era, an enormous elephant named Zunesha committed what the surviving fragments describe only as a grave crime. We are never told, in any account preserved to the present, exactly what that crime was. What we do know is the punishment. Zunesha was sentenced to walk the sea floor forever, an island-sized body dragging itself across the ocean bed without rest, without the right to stop, without even the ability to defend itself or the civilization living on its back, unless someone with the correct authority gave an explicit order to do so. It has been walking, by the time of the present story, for well over 1,000 years. What connects this ancient elephant to Joy Boy is a promise almost as heavy as the one carved for Poseidon, though far less documented, understood mostly through implication and a handful of quiet, aching moments centuries later. Zunesha appears, at points in the present-day story, to be listening for something, waiting for a voice or a permission that never quite arrives, carrying grief in a scale that matches its body, grief old enough that it has become simply the texture of its existence rather than an event within it. When, many centuries later, a small boy named Kozuki Momonosuke manages to reach across that unimaginable interior distance and speak to the creature directly, something in Zunisha responds that had been dormant for the better part of a millennium. It is not a small moment in the story, even though it arrives quietly. It is the sound of an ancient promise being remembered by the only party still alive who was there when it was made. Zunisha does not walk alone, and has not walked alone for as long as anyone can account for. An entire civilization lives on its back, the Mink tribe, a people who have never once in their history touched solid ground that was not, in some fundamental sense, also a living creature. Their culture developed entirely around the experience of dwelling on something ancient and moving and burdened. Their homeland literally named Zu after the elephant that carries it, their sense of time shaped by tides and by the elephant's slow, endless gait, rather than by seasons the way land-bound people usually measure things. The Mink live with an old, quiet loyalty that seems, in its own way, to mirror the loyalty the Shandians once held for a buried stone they could no longer reach. They protect Zunisha. They tend to it. They do not fully know why it walks, only that it always has, and that the walking itself has simply become the shape of their entire history, the way a river's course becomes the shape of a valley over enough centuries. When the exiled Shogun Kozuki Momonosuke, still a child by any ordinary measure, finally found his way to Zu, carrying the last living connection to the Kozuki bloodline that had once helped carve the Poneglyphs during the Void Century, something in that ancient, tired creature seemed to recognize the thread being handed back to it. It is not described in the story with any grand explanation. It arrives quietly, almost shyly, the way genuinely old things tend to reveal themselves. This is, perhaps, the loneliest shape Joy Boy takes across the whole of the timeline. Not a rebel, not a warrior, though the fragments suggest he may have fought plenty. A person who made commitments to enormous, ancient, suffering things, and then ran out of time before he could see any of them through. An apology to a princess, a promise to an elephant, a message left on an island at the edge of the world for someone who would not arrive for 8 centuries. If you're feeling the particular ache of that pattern settle over you, that's all right. Let it settle the way everything else has settled tonight. We're not finished. There's more warmth coming, further along. Because there is another piece of Joy Boy that survives, one that has nothing to do with stone or apology, and everything to do with the people who had the least power in the world he lived in. Roughly 900 years before the events of the present-day story, a devil fruit existed that would eventually be renamed by the very institution most threatened by what it represented. Its true name is the Hito Hito no Mi model Nika, a mythical zone type said to transform its user into the form of an ancient sun god, a figure remembered in old folklore as a being of total, unshackled freedom, a warrior said to fight for the sake of the people with the least freedom of anyone, specifically those held in slavery. The legend of Nika persisted for centuries among exactly the people who most needed something to hope for, not in official histories, which mostly forgot it or never bothered to record it, but in the quiet, passed-down way that folk stories survive among people the official histories were never written for. It is said, in the fragments the story gives us, that Nika was worshipped specifically by those who had nothing else, by people bought and sold as property, by communities who had every material reason to have given up hope generations earlier and simply had not. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that a myth about total, joyful, unstoppable freedom took root most deeply, not among the powerful who had little need of it, but among the powerless who needed it enough to keep it alive across centuries of silence, passed hand to hand and voice to voice. The way you pass a small flame through a long, cold night, cupping it carefully so the wind does not take it. In the present-day story, this legend surfaces in a strikingly specific and devastating context. A child slave aboard a celestial dragon ship, generations after the Void Century, keeping a small hand drum, playing a rhythm that had once been used long ago to summon the Sun Warrior in stories told by people just like her, in circumstances just like hers. She does not know the full history behind the rhythm she is playing. She only knows that it is old, and that it belongs to a story about someone coming to set people like her free. She plays it quietly, almost secretly, the way you keep something precious close to your chest, in a place where precious things are usually taken from you. Years and years later, on a rooftop above a burning fortress in Wano, that same rhythm returns to her, faster now, wilder, coming from somewhere across the sea she cannot see, and she recognizes it instantly, the way you recognize a voice you have not heard since childhood but would know anywhere. The world government, for its part, appears to have understood exactly what it was dealing with. At some point during its long campaign of managing dangerous knowledge, whoever within its highest ranks identified the Nika legend and its associated devil fruit treated the discovery with the same seriousness it once reserved for the Poneglyphs themselves. It renamed the fruit publicly the Hito no Mi model. Nika, becoming, in every official record, accessible to the public, simply the ordinary Gomu Gomu no Mi, the ordinary Gum Gum fruit, stripped of every trace of the mythic warrior it was meant to represent. And it ensured, deliberately and over generations, that the fruit kept moving from hand to hand, never allowed to settle anywhere long enough for anyone to recognize what it truly was. A senior figure within the government's ranks would later admit, in a moment of candor, the story affords very few of its most powerful characters, that this was, by his own account, the single funniest and most nervous joke he had ever been part of, watching centuries pass while the most dangerous myth of liberation in the world's history sat disguised as an unremarkable rubber body fruit, waiting for someone to finally eat it who understood what freedom was actually for. The world government, it turns out, was not indifferent to this legend. At some point in its long campaign of managing dangerous knowledge, It identified the Nika legend and the fruit associated with it as a threat serious enough to warrant direct intervention. It renamed the devil fruit publicly, calling it simply the Gomu Gomu no Mi, the ordinary gum-gum fruit, stripping away every trace of its mythic name and its association with a warrior of liberation, and it ensured the fruit was kept moving generation after generation, deliberately steered away from ever landing in hands that might understand what it truly was capable of becoming. It is, when you sit with it, one of the driest and most quietly devastating pieces of the whole story. An institution built on erasure took one look at a myth about freedom for the powerless, and treated it exactly the way it had treated the Void Century itself, something to bury, something to keep from being remembered clearly. If that quiet unfairness is sitting heavy with you right now, let it settle and pass through, the way weather passes through, without needing to hold on to it. We're going to follow this thread all the way to its warmer ending, and it will get there, I promise you that. Because for 800 years, a fruit carrying that buried legend passed from hand to hand, steered and mismanaged and deliberately misunderstood, until it ended up by what the story frames as something closer to inevitability than accident, inside a treasure chest in the small East Blue village of Fuchsia, in the possession of a red-haired pirate captain who had sailed as a boy under Gold D. Roger himself. A child in that village, a boy who had grown up with no particular claim to greatness beyond the total, uncomplicated intensity of his own wanting, ate from that chest without understanding what it was. His body was transformed permanently into something the world would spend years believing was simply rubber. It would take nearly 2 decades and a war that shook the world's political center at Marineford before that boy came to understand what he had actually eaten. And it would take even longer, past a crushing defeat, past a battle in Wano fought against one of the most powerful beings on the sea, before that understanding turned into something visible. The fight on Onigashima had, by that point, already gone on for the better part of a day and a night. Luffy had faced Kaido across multiple exchanges, each one ending the same discouraging way, with Luffy on the ground and Kaido barely marked, a being who had survived assassination attempts, warfare, imprisonment, and his own repeated efforts to end his own life, simply standing there afterward, the way a mountain stands after a storm has passed through it. By the time of their final exchange, Luffy had been struck down enough times that anyone watching, and several people were watching, quietly began to believe they were witnessing the end of something rather than the beginning of it. And then, in the space between one collapse and the next attempt to stand, something shifted. Observers described his skin turning a stark white, his usual coiled black hair bleaching pale, small clouds gathering almost playfully around his shoulders as if the sky itself had decided to lean in closer to watch. He laughed. Not the laugh of someone winning cleanly, but the specific, unrestrained laugh the old legends described, the laugh of a warrior who fights joyfully, who bends the world instead of breaking against it, who cannot be pinned down by rules that were only ever built to contain ordinary things. What followed did not look like an ordinary continuation of the fight that had come before it. Luffy's rubber body stopped behaving like rubber in any way that resembled physics as Kaido or anyone else watching understood it, bending distance itself around him, turning the ground beneath his feet soft and pliable, turning his own laughter into something that seemed to physically press against his opponent the way sound is not supposed to be able to. Kaido, who had spent decades being the single most immovable object most of the New World had ever encountered, found himself being moved, pushed, bent, and eventually driven down through the sky and into the earth below Wano's floating fortress. It was not a clean, tidy ending. Nothing in that battle had been clean or tidy at any point. But it was unmistakably an ending. And the ancient legend of a warrior who could not be contained had, after 800 years of careful institutional effort to make sure no one would ever recognize it again, simply stood back up in the middle of the world and made itself known. Gear 5th arrived, and with it, the sun came back to Wano's sky for the first time in 20 years, the artificial clouds Kaido's crew had maintained to keep the country in a permanent gray twilight, finally breaking apart and drifting off toward the horizon. And somewhere far off, on other islands, in other ports, drums that carry the old rhythm without anyone quite knowing why, sped up to match him, a whole scattered population of people who had never met Luffy and never would, feeling something shift in the middle of an ordinary day without being able to say exactly what it was. If it feels good to imagine that, a whole scattered, disconnected population feeling something shift without understanding why, let it sit there gently while your own body settles further into stillness. You don't have to hold the tension of the story anymore. It resolved. That part, at least, resolved. It's worth pausing here, in the quietest part of the night, to imagine what an ordinary day might have actually looked like for a person carrying all of this. We tend, when we tell stories about figures like Joy Boy, to picture them permanently mid-legend, laughing on a cliff somewhere with the wind behind them. But he would have had mornings, too. He would have had meals and small disappointments, and days when the promise to Poseidon felt manageable, and days when it felt impossible, and days probably when he simply forgot about it for a few hours, the way anyone forgets the weight of an unfinished thing when the sun is out and there is something simpler in front of them. The old giants of Elbaf, who are said in the story's own folklore to remember this era more directly than almost anyone else, since giants live for centuries and pass their memories down through warrior songs rather than written record, speak of him not as a distant myth, but as something closer to a friend they lost. Their songs describe him with a kind of easy fondness, the way you describe someone who used to eat at your table rather than the reverent distance you'd use for a god. That detail matters. It suggests that whatever else Joy Boy was, an heir to a mythic fruit, a carrier of an unbearable promise, a name careful enough to survive a century of deliberate erasure, he was also, to the people who actually spent time with him, simply someone they liked having around. Grand as his unfinished business turned out to be, the giants remember the ordinary parts too, the meals and the jokes and the particular sound of his laugh, before it ever needed to mean anything more than a person enjoying his own life. Let's slow down and look at this from a little further back, the way you might step away from a very close painting to see the whole shape of it. There is a theory, carried by several of the story's own characters, and never definitively confirmed or denied by the narrative itself, that Joy Boy was not simply a person who once lived and once carried the Nika fruit's power. There is a suggestion, made explicitly by voices as significant as the giant elder Zunatia and the shipwright Frankie's own reasoning about the story's shape, that Joy Boy is less a specific individual locked to one lifetime and more something closer to a title or a role passed forward across centuries to whoever happens to be standing in the right place with the right heart at the right moment. Under this reading, the Void Century's Joy Boy and the present day's Monkey D. Luffy are not the same person reincarnated in any literal sense, but two people who briefly became the same kind of thing, carrying the same unfinished work forward by however small a distance they each managed to cover in their own lifetime. This idea does not come from nowhere within the story itself. It is suggested carefully and without ever being stated as flat fact by more than one character who has reason to know. Zunisha itself, when finally given the chance to speak plainly after 1,000 years of silence, refers to Luffy not by simply identifying him as a reincarnation, but by acknowledging the resemblance in a tone that reads more like recognition than certainty. The way you might look at a friend's grown child and see something of the parent in a gesture rather than in the face itself. Frankie, standing on the deck of the Thousand Sunny somewhere in the middle of the story, works through the logic out loud in his own blunt way, noting that a devil fruit user cannot simply be reborn as another devil fruit user carrying the exact same power, since devil fruits do not pass down through bloodlines or reincarnation in any way the story has ever established elsewhere. Whatever Joy Boy and Luffy share, it is not a soul returning to claim the same seat twice. It is something more like a role becoming available again after 8 centuries of being deliberately kept vacant, and a person simply proving, through the accident of eating the right fruit at the right moment in his life, unusually well suited to fill it. It is a gentle kind of continuity if you think about it that way. Not a single hero returning to finish his interrupted business, but something more like a relay, where the runner who could not finish the race hands what they were carrying to whoever comes next, capable of picking it up, even if that handoff happens across 800 years and neither party ever meets the other. Joy Boy could not keep his promise to Poseidon. He could not stay for whatever Zunisha needed from him. He reached Laugh Tale, but could go no further with what he found there. And so he left pieces of himself in stone and in a fruit, and in a promise held by an ancient elephant, trusting, in whatever way a person facing the end of their unfinished work can trust anything, that someone eventually would come along able to close what he had left open. That is, in its own quiet way, one of the calmest ideas buried inside this entire sprawling story. That failure does not have to be final. That a promise you cannot keep in your own lifetime does not have to disappear with you if you're careful enough about how you leave it behind. That the right kind of unfinished work, held in the right kind of indestructible material, can simply wait, patiently, for as long as it needs to, until the right person happens to walk by and read it. If you're feeling sleepy now, that's exactly where we want to be. Let your eyes close if they haven't already. I'll keep the story moving softly beneath you. There is another thread worth following here quietly because it never quite resolves into a clean answer, and that unresolved quality is part of what makes it feel so at home in this particular story. Throughout the present-day timeline, certain bloodlines carry a middle initial, simply the letter D, tucked between a given name and a family name, and characters who carry it are treated, by those who understand its significance, as people the world government watches especially carefully. Gold D, Roger carried it. Monkey D, Luffy carries it. Portgas D, Ace carried it. So did Rox D. Zebek, the man who once commanded a crew that included 3 future emperors of the sea before it ever fell apart. No character within the story has ever been permitted to explain, in full and certain terms, what the letter actually means. Only that it appears to carry old significance connected somehow to the ancient kingdom, to Joy Boy's own era, and to a phrase repeated by more than one dying or nearly dying figure across the generations, the promise that the will of Duos will bring a coming storm to the world, whatever that storm eventually turns out to be. Scholars within the story, the few who survived long enough to study any of this seriously, treat the D as a kind of surname belonging not to a bloodline exactly, but to an old alliance or an old people, possibly connected to the very ancient kingdom the world government spent so much effort erasing. It is entirely possible that Joy Boy himself carried it, though no confirmed record says so directly. It would explain, in its own quiet way, why so much of what follows him, 8 centuries of scattered promises finally converging on a boy from a small East Blue village, seems to move with the specific stubborn persistence of something being carried forward on purpose rather than by accident. We are not going to solve that particular mystery tonight. Some things are more restful left exactly where the story has left them, sitting patiently in the dark, waiting for their own proper hour. There is still more to trace, and none of it needs urgency, so let's move slowly through it. The rising sea level that Dr. Vegapunk spent his final working years quietly documenting is, according to his own broadcast findings, connected to this same buried history, a slow physical consequence of choices made or unmade during the void century, one more piece of unfinished business left over from an age the world government worked so hard to erase that even its natural consequences were left unaddressed. Vegapunk broadcast what he knew to the entire world at enormous personal cost, because he seemed to believe, in his own careful scientist's way, the same thing the Kozuki clan believed when they carved their Poneglyphs, that some truths are worth risking everything to keep from disappearing completely, even if you will not live to see what anyone does with them. Vegapunk's own life is worth pausing on for a moment because his relationship to this buried history mirrors Joy Boy's own in a way that feels almost intentional, even if centuries separate them. He was, by most accounts, the single greatest scientific mind the world had produced in generations, responsible for technologies the world government relied on constantly, the pacifista weapons, the Seraphim, advances in sea stone application and cyborg engineering that reshaped what the Navy was capable of. And yet, for all of that usefulness to the very institution built on erasure, he spent his final working years quietly turning his enormous intellect toward exactly the question that institution had spent 1,500 years trying to make unaskable. What actually happened during the void century, what the ancient kingdom actually was, what the rising sea level slowly swallowing islands across the world actually meant, and whether it traced back to something left unfinished from that same buried era. He built an entire island laboratory, Egghead, to hold the work, staffed by satellite versions of himself, each one carrying a different facet of his personality and his research. And when the moment came that he believed the truth could no longer wait for official permission, he did what Joy Boy himself seemed to do again and again across the story. He risked everything he had built to make sure the truth outlived him. He broadcast his findings to the entire world through a transponder snail network, knowing it would bring every resource the world government possessed down on Egghead within hours. It did. And still he broadcast it because somewhere in the calculation he'd made, the truth surviving mattered more than his own safety. The same calculation the Kozuki clan made when they carved their Poneglyphs. The same calculation Nika Olvia made when she chose to return to Ohara rather than run. The same calculation, in its own quiet way, that Joy Boy seems to have made 800 years earlier when he carved an apology into stone instead of simply letting his failure disappear with him. And there is the ship, Noah, still resting on the ocean floor near Fishman Island, still connected to whatever promise Joy Boy could not keep to Poseidon, still waiting, the way so much in this story waits, for the specific moment it was built for to finally arrive. We do not yet know, as of the most recent chapters available to us, exactly what that moment will look like, or whether it has already quietly begun. That uncertainty is all right to sit with. Not every stone has been read yet. Not every promise has come due. Some of it is still moving forward, the way water moves forward under a hull, slow and steady and entirely unconcerned with how long the crossing takes. What we can say, gathering everything together the way you might gather scattered stones into a single quiet pile before sleep, is this. Joy Boy lived somewhere inside 100 years the world spent 15 centuries trying to make disappear. He loved, or at least deeply cared for, a mermaid princess he could not save in time. He carried a promise for an ancient, suffering elephant that would not be answered for 1,000 years. He carried inside his own body a legend of freedom old enough and dangerous enough that an entire government structured itself partly around keeping it quiet. He reached the end of the known world and left something there for whoever came next. And when Roger came next, 800 years later, he laughed so hard it named an island. And when Luffy came after that, 800 years after Roger, he laughed the same laugh in the middle of a battle that should have already been lost, and the sky over a closed country opened for the first time in 20 years. None of the promises are fully kept yet. Not the one to Poseidon, not the one to Zunatia, not even, really, the full promise of Laugh-Tale itself, since the story tells us there is still one road Poneglyph the Straw Hats do not have, still one piece of the map not yet gathered. But something has clearly been set back into motion after 8 centuries of careful, deliberate stillness. A fruit that was hidden reappeared, a name that was buried resurfaced, a laugh that was silenced echoed across an entire closed nation, and was heard faintly on the drums of people who had no idea why their hands suddenly wanted to play faster. If you're most of the way asleep now, that's exactly right. Let the rest of this wash over you rather than land squarely. Somewhere out on a sea that never stops moving, a boy in a straw hat that used to belong to someone else is still sailing toward an island most of the world still doesn't believe in, carrying, whether he fully understands it or not, the unfinished business of a man who died 800 years before he was born. The elephant is still walking. The ship is still waiting on the ocean floor. The stone with the apology on it is still down there in the dark and the cold, patient the way only stone can be patient, holding a regret that has outlasted every empire that tried to bury it. And somewhere, eventually, in a chapter none of us have read yet, the promise gets kept or it doesn't, and either way, the story keeps moving forward the way it always has. One laugh, one dawn, one small act of stubborn hope at a time. Think for a moment about how strange and how quietly hopeful it is that any of this survived at all. An entire government with warships and warlords and an army of agents dedicated specifically to the erasure of inconvenient truth spent 1,500 years trying to make sure that 100-year stretch of history simply stopped existing in anyone's mind. And it very nearly worked. Most of the world today lives without ever thinking about the void century at all. The same way you and I move through most of our days without thinking about the deep ocean floor beneath a ship we've never sailed on. And yet, because one clan decided to carve their truth into a stone that could not be destroyed, because one apology was left in a place patient enough to keep it, because one ancient elephant remembered a promise for 1,000 years without anyone asking it to, because one legend kept surviving in the quiet, private hope of people who had every reason to give up on it, the erasure did not fully take. Something got through. Something always seems to get through in this particular story, no matter how thoroughly the people in charge try to make sure it doesn't. That is, perhaps, the gentlest thing this whole sprawling tale has to offer you tonight, on the edge of sleep. Not that Joy Boy's promises are all kept yet, because they aren't. Not the one to Poseidon, not the one to Zunisha, not even the full promise buried in the name Laughtail carries. But that unfinished things, left carefully enough, in good enough hands, tended by people willing to wait centuries without giving up, do not have to stay unfinished forever. The elephant is still walking, but it has already been heard once. The ship is still waiting on the ocean floor, but the tide keeps moving toward it regardless. The stone with the apology is still down there in the cold and the dark, but it has already been read once by someone who understood exactly how much weight was pressed into those old, careful letters. Whatever comes next in this story, whenever the next chapter finally puts it down on the page, it will be building on top of 800 years of things that were never allowed to fully disappear, no matter how hard the world tried to make sure they did. Thank you for your time.